Hi, welcome. Vicente Cedarberg's exciting webinar today. FDA decided not to do anything. What does that mean? It was another alternative title, but a little classier. FDA Punts CBD regulation. What does this mean for hemp businesses? My name is Michelle Bodian. I'm a partner at the law firm and co-chair of our hemp and cannabinoid practice. I'm going to ask my esteemed colleagues to introduce themselves, and we're going to do a quick run of show and then dive right in. Got a lot to cover in this hour. We will be leaving time for questions at the end. There is a Q&A button kind of separate from the chat. We encourage you to drop your questions in there so we can mark them as read or not read. Want to answer them live, as well as I know everyone wants to know, the PowerPoint will be available after the webinar. And we do have our esteemed colleague Jen from marketing manning the PowerPoint. So we will be saying next slide, please. So next slide, please. There you go. Andrea, if I can ask you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. So I'm Andrea Golan. I work in the Vicente Cedarberg Los Angeles office. And I primarily do work with clients on regulatory compliance in the cannabis, hemp, and food and beverage space.
Great, thanks. And Casey?
I'm Casey Lever. I'm our Director of Regulatory Compliance out of our Boston office, handling national compliance, mostly the East Coast, but covering hemp as well with Michelle and Andrea's help.
Great. So today we're going to cover the FDA press announcement, kind of what brought us here today. Then going to touch on the citizen petition denials, which kind of had a lot more meat than what was actually in the one-page press release. Then talking about some legislative forecasting of what might this mean, then diving into state regulation, some states to watch, and then of course leaving time for questions at the end. So to kick things off with all things FDA, I'm going to hand it over to you, Andrea.
Thanks, Michelle. So yeah, as Michelle mentioned, we definitely want to kick this off by talking about FDA's recent responses to 3 citizens petitions. As most, if not all of you know, at the end of January, FDA released responses to these petitions, each of which ask FDA to act in a variety of ways to allow the sale of CBD in dietary supplements. We'll walk through briefly the citizen petition process, what the petitioners asked for, and the key takeaways from FDA's responses. Next slide, please. So,
sorry, just to jump in there, I think, sorry, it might be a little mix up with the slide order from what we had practiced, but just starting with FDA press release first, I think, before diving into the citizen petition. So maybe if we can go back a slide, there we go. The press release being the first item up on the agenda.
Yeah, so these are, as I was saying, these are, FDA's responses to 3 citizens petitions. They issued a press release that sort of gives a general overview of what the petitioners asked for and their response to those petitions. And as you can see from the quotes that we've highlighted there, again, we're going to talk about these key takeaways later on, but essentially FDA, as we've said, has punted on providing a regulatory pathway for CBD. FDA says that the current framework is not particularly conducive to regulate dietary supplements. And given the available evidence, it's not apparent how CBD could meet the safety standards of the existing requirements for dietary supplements. So next slide. Thanks, Jen. And as we'll discuss, from an FDA enforcement perspective, FDA's response does not indicate any significant change in enforcement priorities. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as well.
Yeah, and then just in terms of their enforcement to date, just to kind of set the stage of where they've been, this just highlights the number of warning letters that have been issued to date from FDA. And, it does include COVID-19 related warning letters, which we did see that spike in 2020, for hemp-derived CBD products that were claiming these products would help cure COVID-19, obviously particular focus and pain point for FDA. And that kind of explains some of the uptick of warning letters over the years, but certainly plenty of years of stabilization and not much happening despite the proliferation of these products across the market.
Let me unmute myself. So what is a citizen petition? The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act provides a mechanism where any person can petition the FDA to issue, amend, or revoke a regulation. As relevant here, and as I'm sure most listeners are aware, FDA's position is that CBD and THC are subject to the drug preclusion provision and prohibition, which prohibits an article that has been authorized as a new drug or approved as a new drug or authorized for investigation as a new drug from being marketed as a dietary supplement. However, there's a mechanism that allows FDA to override this drug preclusion prohibition by submitting a citizen petition asking that it create an exception to this prohibition by a regulation. 3 prominent industry groups, as you can see here, filed citizens petitions, some of them going back to 2019. So that's the overview of the citizens petition.
It's pretty good timing for federal government response. Apologies to any government workers.
Yeah, just 4 years. No big deal. So common to all 3 of the citizens petitions was a request, as I explained, that FDA exercise its statutory authority and discretion under that drug exclusion provision to issue a regulation finding that hemp-derived CBD is a lawful dietary ingredient. So there's other requests in those citizens petitions, but all 3 asked FDA to act in this manner. Next slide. So, again, the first one common to all 3 is asking FDA to issue a new regulation. The petitioners also asked that FDA exercise enforcement discretion, just sort of like not enforce in a very specific and selective manner over CBD products after they've been reviewed on the basis of the safety standards and the new dietary ingredient process. The petitioners asked, or some of the petitioners asked, that FDA continue and also increase enforcement against manufacturers that are making illegal drug claims or otherwise failing to comply with regulatory requirements for dietary supplements. One of the petitioners asked that FDA provide guidance clarifying when a substance is considered an article in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And again, as we'll discuss, FDA declined to do that and the above. And that FDA enforced existing dietary supplement regulations, even though, with respect to CBD, even though CBD is subject to the drug preclusion. So that's really just a good overview of what was requested in all 3 citizens petitions. Next slide. So takeaways, the big takeaway, there's a couple of big takeaways. One, FDA said, no, we're not going to exercise our statutory authority to issue a regulation. And they based that primarily on safety concerns with CBD. And even though I think all 3 petitioners argued that FDA, there's nothing in the statute that requires FDA to look at safety standards in issuing a regulation, FDA claimed that it had, authority to do that. And the second big key takeaway, this bullet here, number 2, is that even if FDA were to issue a regulation overriding that drug preclusion permission. The current framework established under, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and DSHEA is that that current framework is not sufficient to evaluate the safety of dietary supplements. It doesn't prevent unsafe dietary supplements from entering the market, and a new regulatory framework is, in essence, is needed for CBD, and it sounds like really for any dietary supplement. I'll highlight one more here. To the request that FDA define or provide guidance on whether a broad or full spectrum extract is the same article as the CBD in the FDA approved drug. FDA said we've already done that. We've done that through our latest NDI, new dietary ingredient draft guidance, and it was discussed in the PharmaNext case, and that should be sufficient. And for those of you who are not familiar with the PharmaNext case, take a look. I mean, that's pretty significant that FDA is saying those factors are valid. In that case, FDA said, and the court said, if the ingredient or the article has been engineered to be at specifically high levels, it would be considered the same article. I mean, that's kind of an oversimplification, but that's one of the key takeaways from the PharmaNext case.
I guess before we move on from this slide, obviously this is all related to hemp CBD. I think we all acknowledge cannabis is one plant. We drew the line at 0.3%, suddenly started calling it hemp. They've had a much better marketing person than marijuana. There's always the jokes out there. So is there anything we can talk to or, frame what this might mean for future implications for federal FDA regulations of marijuana, given that, 2018 Farm Bill five years ago, we're coming up on the next one, and it took, this long to get to a point of there's no pathway forward absence a new law?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to predict because, the agency moves so slowly and Congress clearly moves so slowly, particularly right now. I think that we can see a future where, these safety standards are imposed on cannabis, i.e. marijuana products, just like on regular dietary supplements. So I think we could see that at some point in the future.
Okay, I guess next slide. Which leads to what legislation may there be to address this. So FDA's, recent statement that they're not going to shoehorn CBD into any of the existing frameworks, but they're looking at Congress to set a new framework. I guess before diving into what laws might be on the horizon, Andrew, if I could just ask, to talk through, do we think that such a framework is going to be just limited to CBD, or we think if Hemp Access and Consumer Safety Act or future farm bills, or do you think we might be waiting for one holistic regulatory pathway for all aspects of the plant, or do you think that there might be hope for some narrow legislation just hyper-focused on CBD?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like CBD, the cannabinoid CBD in dietary supplements, if anything were to happen, I think it would be narrowly focused on that. I don't think that there will be anything that addresses CBD or THC in food. And I don't think we'll see anything related to THC, but I'm not particularly optimistic, but if there is going to be a narrow pathway, it would be just CBD and just in dietary supplements. Okay.
Put you on the spot with your predictions. So in terms of what, FDA saying, Congress, you need to do something here. So what's the something? So right now, Senator Wyden released a statement, Democrat out of Oregon, saying he will reintroduce the Hemp Access and Consumer Safety Act. This bill was previously introduced, got a number of sponsors, but ultimately, as we're all aware, didn't pass. But it would allow hemp-derived ingredients to be included in both food and dietary supplement products. However, this is not, a blank prohibition. That's not the end of the sentence. The legislation does have some caveats to it. Manufacturers would have to go through existing NDNI or GRAS processes. And it doesn't allow all other cannabinoids to be permitted. So it was narrowly focused on CBD, as Andrea anticipated. Then, as I mentioned, farm bills are every 5 years. We've seen 18 of them since 1933. Just fun fact in case anyone wanted to know how many farm bills there's been. And it's an omnibus bill that talks about all things spending, for the agricultural sector, farm income support, food assistance, trade, conservation programs. So a lot of stuff goes into it, and it's renewed about every 5 years. Sometimes it does take 6 to get it done. With some negotiations, but essentially we're coming up on the next farm bill. Negotiations have been underway for months, kind of really kicking off in earnest over the past couple weeks. We do anticipate, this getting signed, if everything goes well, fingers crossed, in December. And, as we are aware, 2014 Farm Bill authorized for research purposes, market research, which is, we all called commercial, and we all went to town in the industry. And then 2018 Farm Bill, the real deal that, ended up with the industry we have today. So I think a lot of businesses and trade groups and lobbying groups are looking to the 2023 Farm Bill as the vehicle to expressly have this congressional authorization that FDA says they need in order to act. Too soon to tell whether it's going to be able to get the language inserted that we need, whether it's a delegation of authority to FDA, express requirement to act. But I think as we start seeing drafts of the bill, we can talk more concrete about what might be in the Farm Bill. But I keep coming back to it, and I spelled out what it is, just to remind everyone that first and foremost, this is an agricultural bill. And so there's only so much that can get done within it. So I just want to temper expectations that we're not establishing the entire regulatory framework in the Farm Bill, but there might be delegations of authority or investigations. Not saying nothing could get done, but it might not be the golden ticket that we'd all hope in terms of timing. And then, to be determined what new legislation is going to be introduced. I certainly think that FDA statement has, and we saw the press releases to this effect, disappointed a lot of individuals in the industry, and including, our representatives in Congress who might have more of an appetite now to act, now that FDA has officially confirmed they will not be finding a path forward for us all. Next slide. So that was the very brief, not so brief, and we'll dive back in a little bit into the federal overview. So I want to turn it over to Casey to say, we aren't seeing much movement at the federal level. What does that mean at the state level in terms of compliance and for all the states that defer to FDA? Casey, if you can give us a brief overview.
Sure. Yep. As you can see from these lists here, there are states that defer to FDA or otherwise prohibit CBD in foods and or dietary supplements. And there are also states that expressly allow CBD to be added to food and or dietary supplements. What you're going to see within the states that have contemplated regulations is they're acknowledging, yes, these products exist, and we want to regulate them in a manner that allows that to be consumed safely. What that means is not the same across states. Just like cannabis and just like any other state regulations, they vary pretty widely. Some of the regulations include testing, which again will vary by state. You'll see a lot of the testing components will change, whether or not they include certain pesticides or foreign matter testing. That's going to vary as well. There's certainly a lot of variance within labeling requirements, whether they just defer to FDA for the labeling requirements or, like California, have a consideration for Prop 65 if the product contains any amount of THC, which again is going to vary by product, vary by certificate of analysis or testing and batches. They also, amongst the states, you can see the notes on here that they will also prohibit certain product types within their own regulatory framework. We also see some age restrictions and retailer restrictions, meaning it can only be sold to somebody who's 18 plus, 21 plus, in whether it's online retail or retail stores. That also kind of includes some of the marketing and advertising prohibitions as well. And there's also some states that require specific registration. There are some states that require retail registrations. 10 states actually include online seller registration. And of those 10 states, 5 require label review as a part of that registration. So your product packaging and labeling becomes very important. And knowing that when you're going into different states and you want a CBD product that you want to take nationally, what does that mean as you enter a state? What are the requirements for your labeling, different licensing components, and things you need to generally be aware of? Now, the other states on this list that defer to the FDA, this may be the FDA's, deciding not to issue any regulation, may be the push they need to start regulating within their own state certain CBD products, registrations, or whatever, labeling requirements that they want to. Some of these states had been kind of waiting on the FDA to issue some sort of statement or make a move. And now that they haven't, this may be the time that we're going to see a lot of these states come forward and start to make some decisions.
So I think that is a helpful overview of, the patchwork or the quilt, as we call it, in terms of even post 14 Farm Bill, post 18 Farm Bill, states acting essentially as mini FDAs and passing their own laws, guidance, policies, FAQs, because of course they all do a blend of all of the above to convey the information of how they want these products sold and market, if they're even allowed. And we just always go back into our map. Those of you who've watched our webinars before, we've been doing this for years, and thankfully for this point, most of this country is green, meaning there are no specific product type restrictions for use of CBD in a food and dietary supplement. The colors over the years have changed drastically, thankfully with green spreading across most of it. And we just did want to focus, FDA is the topic point, what brought us all here today, but absence FDA regulation, we did want to note all of the state rules that exist today. And if we can move on to the next slide, keeping track of all this information in terms of, what does FDA's guidance mean for you? It means, unfortunately, probably more state headache, more state by state compliance. Of course, every state wants to be a little bit different and put their own stamp on it. So a lot of the state rules conflict in terms of everything Casey mentioned. So labeling, age restriction, product type restriction. So it's a lot of information and data to keep track of, and how to navigate if you do want to have, and in order to be successful in this business this day and age, have a national presence for your product. And so we do want to highlight, make sure if you hadn't already been keeping track of state rules, and if you haven't already been trying to come up with a universal label, which is of course near impossible, but trying your hardest to get close, or picking the most restrictive state labeling requirements and conforming your product to that. So all of this is to say, make sure you are informed of what the rules are in each individual state. There's a lot of tools out there to help get you there. Obviously, VS, we do provide some of these to our clients on a subscription, monthly basis, because of course it changes, because why would you want anything to stay the same in this industry? So just, for example, keeping track of all the various product types that are permitted is one layer. Then labeling, packaging, age restrictions, registrations. Casey mentioned retailer registration. There's individual product registration. Some states require wholesale licenses. In some states, it's not quite as obvious, like Michigan, technically you need a processor handler license if you're selling, even though of course, the word sale is not present in processor handler, but if you read the definition, it does trip up even online sales to customers located in state. So, long story short, absence a unified federal approach, we do anticipate seeing the state-by-state patchwork of not even CBD specific, hemp-derived cannabinoid patchwork. It's just not as catchy, so we shortened it. But CBD could stand in for all other cannabinoids. The patchwork's going to continue in the foreseeable future. Next slide. So, Casey, given that what you highlighted of a lot of states have already passed legislation, do we anticipate a flood of more regulation at the state level, or status quo?
Yeah, I think the anticipation is the states that were waiting for the FDA to do something will move forward. And, there are some bills that we're going to talk about in the next slide in some states that we wanted to focus on that we do expect movement maybe faster than others based on their current standing. We do think that the states will move to establish, certain risk mitigation tools similar to what the FDA has kind of established regarding, prevention of contaminants, like I talked about with the testing requirements. CBD content limits, which is particularly interesting because, there are some states where, there can be no THC and what that means. So if it's, for example, like not detected, you cannot tell that it's necessarily zero, it's just not detected. Clear labeling requirements, safety warnings for certain populations. We talked about the age restrictions that kind of fall under that certain population too. And the minimum purchasing age, of course, to mitigate risk of ingestion by children. I think that's a big focus in many states and for the FDA as well. So I think that will be huge, possibly dovetail into some packaging requirements, child-resistant packaging, tamper-resistant, all of those. And again, like I had mentioned, states that had been deferring or waiting for the FDA, this may be the time to initiate the rulemaking process. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the states that we should watch in 2023, Arizona.
All of them. I'm going to cut in and just say all of them.
All of them. All right. So these
You
are
never know.
these are the priorities, right? So Arizona was one. Colorado is interesting because there was a bill enacted in 2022 that allowing the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment to promulgate rules prohibiting products that contain chemically modified, converted, or synthesized intoxicating THC isomers, and creates a task force to study intoxicating hemp products. And the task force report has been submitted to the legislature and makes several recommendations, including creating regulatory structures for intoxicating and potentially intoxicating cannabinoids, and establishing a THC limit for final hemp products.
I'm actually going to put a pin in that, Casey, and ask Andrea, I'd say if those who watch our webinars, we've done plenty and we'll continue to do plenty on intoxicating hemp, but I'm just curious your thoughts, given the industry and where we are with intoxicating hemp and a lot of states looking at how to address this, allow it, prohibit it, regulate it. Do we think that FDA's recent announcement of no announcement is suddenly going to allow, CBD, the vanilla cannabinoid of CBD to then be incorporated into some of this intoxicating legislation that maybe didn't think they needed to address it or hadn't been planning on it? I guess how do we think this is going to match up? Using Colorado as the example, if they're already filing a bill related to intoxicating hemp products, is this the time to shore up or change regulation related to CBD?
Yeah, it's a good question. What I've seen more often than not is states carving out CBD, specifically saying CBD is not intoxicating. We're not bringing it into this, a limitation or prohibition on intoxicating cannabinoids. I've seen that in new and existing state regulation more often than not. I think that states, as far as synthetic or intoxicating cannabinoids are concerned, I think they weren't waiting for FDA before, and I don't think they're going to wait for FDA now. I think we're going to see much more regulation in 2023 and thereafter as states, try to address these products that are, essentially available everywhere and are mislabeled and, nobody knows what they're purchasing and nobody knows what's in them and there's really no oversight. So I think that's going to be the big priority for 2023.
Okay. And do you think, in a state, like who can we pick on? New Hampshire or Arizona, where there isn't express guidance allowing CBD, if a bill gets filed talking about or addressing intoxicating, do you think there might be an appetite to say, well, hemp, we're talking about it, so might as well throw something in there also addressing CBD? Or you think kind of the legislative agenda is only able to focus on, one topic, one cannabinoid at a time, and maybe these will be separate bills?
I mean, what I'm seeing is that more states are realizing they want to permit CBD in food and dietary supplements, notwithstanding FDA's position. They realize it's good for, you know, the industry in their state and the farmers in their state, and they want to, you know, enable a way to make that happen, while not, you know, accidentally sweeping in other dangerous or synthetic cannabinoids, as we've been discussing. So I kind of think that I think we'll see more green states on the map also this year. I mean, that's my optimistic view, but that's what I think. I think as the states like Arizona that you mentioned that don't have anything, we'll look and see what other states are doing and doing well, and ideally they'll adopt some of those same rules.
And I always forget and mean to apologize for those in the audience who are colorblind. Just so you're aware, most of that map was green. So sorry if you weren't able to see that. So sorry, and back also to you, Casey, I interrupted, got hijacked. You know, like everything when someone says intoxicating a task force, gotta go off on a tangent there. But if you want to just highlight a couple of the other states listed there and why we've specifically called them out as states to watch, I appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. And also to note on one of Andrea's comments about, you know, getting hemp farmers involved in Massachusetts, for example, you know, the Cannabis Control Commission worked with MDAR to allow, you know,
Department of Ag.
Department of Ag, the MDAR licensed processors to actually sell their products to marijuana establishments so they could then produce products and sell them in their retail facilities. So it was a good way to get farmers to actually have their crop sold, you know, through other regulated channels. Back to the states here to highlight. One that I found particularly interesting to watch is New Jersey, because there is a bill that directs the Cannabis Regulatory Commission, the CRC, to adopt regulations concerning labeling, marketing, and sale of CBD and products containing CBD. It also requires registration and regulation of certain hemp-derived cannabinoids manufactured and sold in the state. I think it's interesting just because it's actually directing the current Cannabis Regulatory Commission to adopt those regulations rather than any other state agency. The other ones to watch, you know, Oklahoma, which the bill right now that we're discussing requires registration of hemp-derived ingestible CBD products. And then West Virginia also has a bill.
And I will say, you know, for these states to watch, most of them, you know, either already has the bill filed, or we know through, you know, private means, we are aware that some might be filed soon. But this press announcement from FDA was only the end of January. A lot of these states are in session. So do you anticipate, Casey, that, you know, it takes time to write a bill and file something, you know, and we only just had a couple weeks to react? So this is states to watch based upon existing bills. Do we think next couple of weeks we might see a flurry of new bills introduced using FDA's, you know, deflated balloon announcement as a catalyst?
I don't know about the next couple of weeks, but I would say, you know, in the near future, maybe next couple of months, or sorry, weeks, whenever they're able to actually get this together. There may be a lot of outstanding bills that have been written and haven't really been reviewed or submitted at this point yet. So I would hope and anticipate we're going to see a little bit more. Again, this is kind of the kick that some of the states needed to, you know, act on some of these pending bills.
All right, and then I think next slide, if we can, you know, I'll take a couple minutes to talk about what each of our impression, kind of pulled the audience here for our biggest takeaways. And then it looks like we do have a bunch of questions, and I want to make sure we leave plenty of time to start talking about it, because I know we went through this quickly. But maybe Andrew, if I can ask you your biggest takeaway, you know, where did this all sit with you? What's your elevator what is it, elevator pitch? Your little brief snippet.
My 2-minute FDA elevator pitch. Yeah, it's
just a head shake. Is that?
Yeah, I'm done. You know, I think we're at status quo in a lot of ways. Well, actually, I take that back. I think in some ways we're at status quo. You know, if you're a manufacturer or a seller of CBD containing products, you know, you continue to adhere to all other FDA requirements, other than, you know, of course, we've got an issue with the drug preclusion, but, you know, packaging, labeling, and so forth. I think that's status quo. I think FDA is really going to act against, you know, like in the past, people who make disease claims or really egregious marketing claims about COVID or monkeypox or you name the disease. I think, of course, we'll continue to see that. And, I think also that sellers of CBD containing products really have to look at each state's laws, because that's where we are, since FDA has decided not to act, and not only decided not to act, but also said the current regulatory framework doesn't work. I think that, you've really got to see what each state requires in order to stay out of trouble.
Yeah, I think paying attention to what's going on in each state is so important, and compliance with those state requirements, the testing requirements, packaging, labeling, and we're really, when we talk about transitioning between states, we talk about, which registrations are required, just being aware of the licensing process. A lot of new guidance and FAQs come out from each state that either provide some insight or some additional requirements that may have not have been initially contemplated when you're going into another state. So really strict compliance with those state regulations, as we do see more and more states come online, and potentially more enforcement on the state level.
I swear we planned this better, but they took all mine. But I think, meaningfully, the difference between before the announcement and today is not much. The only caveat, being, as Casey said, and Andrea, I think this might result in states having more meaningful of a role, especially in those states that were having to step back when we're waiting for FDA to fill the void. I think the fact that it isn't, and these products are so pervasive, that a lot of states are, either through legislation or reg or FAQs, really going to now step in and step up, especially, if congressionally nothing moves quickly. I think I say Congress and quickly in the same sentence there. So
yeah, and maybe we'll see something in the 2023 Farm Bill. I mean, not as far as FDA is concerned, but maybe Congress
definition of hemp.
Definition of hemp, expand the definition of THC, make some allowances for, hemp that's used for non-consumption purposes. We might see that in the 2023 Farm Bill.
All right, that was a positive note. I think, like I said, lots of questions in the chat, so I'm gonna dive in. And if you put them in the chat, but not the Q&A, please move them over so they don't get lost. All right, Andrea, I'm going to kick this one to you because I'm moderating and I get to pick and choose. So if FDA is basically just stepping back and not acting, is there any relevancy to the warning letters, or are they now just toothless regards to enforcement?
It's the same, that hasn't changed. The warning letters aren't toothless because if you get an FDA warning letter, the letter's public, and you need to take action. You need to either modify your package, whatever. It depends on the subject of the warning letter. Is it your facility? Is it your marketing and advertising? The seller has to take some action in response to those warning letters. It's true that FDA has not really pushed in the case that, a company is non-responsive to a degree. But, if
we can't forget CBD seat and their clever title to their actual enforcement action that resulted in some civil penalties beyond the warning letter.
Right, exactly.
Sorry to cut in.
No, you're absolutely right. And, if we see adverse events or the kinds of things we're seeing with Delta 8, I think FDA will definitely step up and increase their enforcement action past warning letters and into civil and maybe even criminal penalties.
And they have the right under FFDCA to do so at any point, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. So just because past behavior has been warning letters without, as you said, much follow-up, if someone doesn't respond and react, that doesn't mean tomorrow they can't change their minds. They do have all the statutory authority they need to act should they want to, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And, Congress just passed recent cosmetic regulations, which, finally for the first time in decades gives FDA authority to actually act against cosmetic companies that are putting unsafe ingredients in their products. And to date, FDA really hasn't had that authority, and they will starting in the future next
Which
year.
is perfect on the question of, is there any discourse about CBDs in topical and cosmetics?
Yeah, that is the discourse. I mean, it's as far as existing law, FDA doesn't object to CBD in a cosmetic product. Again, you have to be very careful with your claims because you can only make limited claims for cosmetic products. But FDA
Can you give an example? I'm going to cut in again. Just keep interrupting you.
an example of a permissible and non-permissible claim.
Yeah, either, both.
Yeah,
either.
yeah. Well, I mean, a cosmetic is defined to, cleanse, beautify, improve the appearance of, and that's what your claims are limited to. So if you start making claims about things that are happening underneath the skin, aside from moisturizing, like removes wrinkles or, alleviates pain in your joints from arthritis, then FDA will consider that a drug and not a cosmetic. So there's FDA does not have an issue with cannabinoids and cosmetics, but you really got to stay within the guideposts as far as your claims are concerned. And then, like I said, starting next year, you're going to have to comply with safety ingredient safety requirements.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I was so engaged in your answer. I was not checking the chat.
Let's see.
Maybe Casey, for you, do states really care about CBD? I know FDA is a thing, but wondering if this is a priority for any state agencies, and maybe you can highlight, as you said, in Massachusetts, we've got a Department of Ag, a Department of Health, and a Cannabis Commission, versus in a state of New York where cannabinoid hemp is rolled with the Cannabis Agency. Is there any difference we might see in terms of enforcement based upon how well funded the agency who's in charge is?
Yeah, that's a good point. I actually think that the level of enforcement and the priority would probably likely be higher in states where it is rolled in with a well-funded commission or cannabis control or whatever the regulatory body
the acronym.
is. Yeah, all the 3 letters or 4 letters, maybe even 5. In other states like California that have had existing regulations and requirements and a Prop 65 warning applying to anything with THC, I think that is where you're going to see a lot of the enforcement, a lot of the priority on making sure that these products are produced safely and highly regulated. I know, there's like public outcry. From my experience in Massachusetts, it's largely around the widespread availability of CBD products in places like gas stations and liquor stores that there doesn't appear to be, at least to the consumer, a lot of regulatory requirements, and they don't know what they're looking at the label. They don't really know what's in it or if it's safe to consume. So I think a lot of the outcry along, those lines will force some oversight.
Apologies, have a sick toddler today. I am not talking myself on mute for once. Thank you, I appreciate that. And I guess, Casey, while you were off mute, I'm calling you back. Given the state by state nature of regulations, do those state retailer registrations, I think you hit on, do they impact online sellers to customers located in those markets, or is it only brick and mortar stores?
They do. It does impact online sellers. Those 10 states, I'd mentioned 10 states and 5 that actually incorporate label review does impact the online sellers, online retailers.
Okay, and then Andrea, practically speaking, I know we talk about this a lot internally, but also with our clients, how's the state to know? Private sale, online, a box shows up, probably UPS, see our shipping blog about how you can ship these products. How's the state going to find out? What's that enforcement mechanism?
Well, it depends on the state. Some states have indicated they sort of have like their own secret, shopper, for lack of a better word, where they're looking to see what's out there and where companies are selling, and they're doing actually putting some money into their own enforcement to see who's selling into their states. I don't think most states do that, but some states do. And otherwise, it's really hard for states to enforce, again, unless somebody gets ill, there's an adverse event, or something bad happens. It's really hard for states to enforce their requirements. I mean, specifically for remote sellers.
Yep. Okay. I guess I'll be magnanimous and take one myself, which with each state being their own fiefdom in regards to legal cannabinoids for sale in their state for online hemp-derived product dispensaries and retailers, does liability fall on the seller or the buyer to comply with ever-changing rules? In terms of all of the rules we just outlined, certainly the onus is on, the manufacturer or the retailer, depending on where they are and what they're doing, to be aware of and comply with the rules. Gave myself an easy one there. In terms of other questions, Andrea, I'm going to ask this one of you because, not that you both don't straddle the line between hemp and marijuana, but I've got a question. Hello from Colorado. Hello. Here, CBD is regulated by the state health department in the same chapter as shellfish. With FDA's announcement, do you think it's more likely that Colorado would move CBD products into a regulated marijuana system, since these products sometimes can contain THC, or keep it separate with the Department of Health and the Environment?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, I don't think it's more likely. And you can, if you go to the Colorado task force page, and I'll put it in the chat. You can look at the task force and all kinds of supporting documents. As CBD, I don't see CBD moving over to the cannabis side at all. What I do see happening, and what the task force discussed at length, was enforcing a ratio between THC and other cannabinoids, like a 15-to-1 ratio. So if you have 2.5 milligrams of THC, you need to have 15 milligrams of CBD for every 2.5 milligrams. So I think we will see ratios like that in Colorado, but we won't see a cannabinoid like CBD move over to the regulated market.
Great, thanks. And Andrea, since you're off mute, will FDA override all of these state fiefdoms, as the gentleman called it, when they do show up to regulate? I guess if you could talk a little bit, kind of bigger picture about the interplay between federal and state law.
Yeah, I mean, if that happens, and again, we're talking about on the hemp side, not the cannabis side, because that's, of course, way more complicated. But generally, yes. I mean, FDA or Congress, if it acts by statute, can preempt state law. So FDA could override some, or all of these individual state requirements.
Okay, and then I'll take the question on the Farm Bill. Regarding the Farm Bill, any view on getting the inclusion of exemption for hemp for fiber and other industrial purposes exempt from CBD regulatory treatment? I think Andrea touched on this briefly, but I do think there's interest and appetite of decoupling, industrial uses, especially I feel like over the past 6 months, there's been a renewed or reinvigorated interest in using hemp fiber and grain for industrial purposes. I think saw there was a grant coming out of Pennsylvania for some, manufacturing equipment. So I do think there's a desire to acknowledge, and whether, Farm Bill is the right mechanism to do so, that these are separate uses, separate manufacturing process, separate end consumers. Obviously, if something is going into, textiles versus being ingested as a dropper, different concerns there. So short answer, sorry, there's a lot of words to say. Yes, I do think there is a likelihood that the Farm Bill, either in the definition of hemp or within the hemp section, will more clearly spell out who has jurisdiction over, industrial hemp product versus, ingestible hemp product. And I think we saw a question about testing. Andrea or Casey, if either want to jump in. I'm seeing a lot of products coming out of, I'm a testing lab, seeing a lot of products coming out of our lab that does not match up with the label claim. Not a lot of information on the COA. Who is controlling these products, and the label and testing requirements are their requirements.
Yeah. Casey, do you want to answer that, or do you want me to answer that?
I'll start. You want to jump in and piggyback off it.
Okay.
It's really going to be dependent on the state and the jurisdiction, whoever is overseeing that particular product. So if it's a state where the regulators are regulating the manufacturer, it would be on them. If it's a state where a product is registered and there's a label review, that would be something that would, get, taken a look at that time when that product registration is occurring. Regarding the COA and not having, the exact amount on the packaging label, some states require it to be very explicitly on there and actually match the COA, where others it's not as explicit of a requirement. So it may be that it's not that it's not compliant. Of course, it could be completely non-compliant and just a product that has made it to the shelves without necessarily oversight. That certainly could happen. But typically that would be based on whatever jurisdiction the manufacturer is in, the retailer, or whatever the registration requirements are in that particular state. And Andrew, I don't know if you want to hit the federal stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing at the, there's specific to cannabinoids. There's not any specific testing requirements at the federal level. I mean, your product, again, with the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, your product has to be safe for consumption and for its intended use. But I mean, it's a great question, because that's really a big issue, is the sort of like, bathtub gin analogy of just people sort of making products with dangerous solvents and selling them online or, in convenience stores with no oversight. And that's a real issue.
And I'm going to ask my own question. Apologies, because it really did, occur to me. We've been talking about FDA. We've talked a little bit about DEA. We've talked a little bit about USDA to throw more names out there with the Farm Bill. Then obviously talking about states. The one name we haven't thrown out here, one agency, and speaking of truth in labeling, FTC, so the Federal Trade Commission, who does regulate, essentially truth in advertising. They've been mum so far. Correct me if I'm wrong. We haven't seen anything out of FTC in response to this. A lot of the historic warning letters coming out of FDA, including the ones from January of this year, co-signed by FTC. An Operation CBD seat, I'm sorry, I just love saying it, it was a joint effort between FDA and FTC. So Andrew, do we think FTC is going to come in and act here, and maybe they're going to fill the federal void, or do we think status quo from them as well?
Well, I mean, FTC is really focused on mislabeling and not truthful, false and misleading statements on products and in advertising. So I think, will we see more FTC action this year? It's really hard to say. Should
we make a bet on it? Come on, we've got a live audience. We can figure out the number of warning letters that we anticipate.
Yes, I'd like to put some money on it.
I don't know if we can bet. Who's in the audience who might know about those rules?
Yeah, it would really be, I'd be totally speculating.
Okay.
I don't see there being anything dramatically, a dramatic increase from last year as far as FTC is concerned.
Okay, absent someone, saying CBD product as approved by FDA, or really misconstruing the response to the citizen petitions or the press release?
Yeah, I think it would have to be quite egregious.
Okay, sorry for putting you on the spot with that one. I got a couple questions along the lines of, you mentioned some of these sting secret shoppers. Is there any more information you can share or name states, or is this, kind of rumors and hearsay?
So I don't remember what states. One of the things that we do, Michelle, you like the chart that you shared, is we have our relationships with state regulators, and we can call them and email them and ask them questions. And that's how I got that information, from talking to one of the state regulators, sort of like, telling me what's really going on the ground. I don't remember. I heard that from 2 different states, but I honestly don't remember which states they
So
were.
tune back in for the next webinar and we will have the answer for you. There you go. We got to make you have wanting more, but we will make sure to have the names of the states top of mind for next webinar if you tune back in. Oh, and we have an answer on betting. You can bet as long as no one profits from the betting. Well, if you don't profit from the betting, what's the fun of betting? But thank you for that answer. All right, I guess last call. Can we go to the last slide just with our contact information in case anyone's looking how to find us or really wants to know those 2 states for secret shoppers and can't wait to our next webinar, which probably won't be too long from now. I'm going to take a look at any other last questions that have come in. Dormant Commerce Clause seems like a great question, but maybe too much for right now. Sorry, trying to scroll quickly. How about, let's see, Senator Wyden has hinted potential FDA process review could be initiated when a CBD maker declares their product as generally recognized as safe and then supplying the scientific proof of safety. I guess we quickly ran through the acronyms before, generally recognized as safe. I'm going to, very specific question. I'm going to try to make it a little bit broader in our last couple minutes. Andrea, given FDA's press announcement, given the denial of the citizen petitions, given the state by state patchwork, aka given our agenda for today, do we think there are creative workarounds and solutions here absent Congress passing some new bill, whether it's the Farm Bill or a standalone bill, or are there other ways to get at this from the side?
As far as FDA is concerned? Yep. I think they're going to be, whatever Congress does, like Wyden's statements, I think ultimately Congress is going to look to FDA for significant and specific guidance on any law it passes. I think they're going to want a lot of FDA's input and they're going to incorporate a lot of FDA's input. So I don't see that Wyden approach. I don't see that working, at least not if Congress is listening to FDA, because FDA would object to that.
And I think all the statements we've seen from FDA to date do talk about, there's been conversations that, this wasn't a surprise to Congress. This was based upon dialogue, is my understanding that's been going on between the agency and members of Congress, on the Hill for a while. So none of this being a surprise to anyone, but maybe the industry. Although, given we're 5 years late, maybe it's not 5 years later, not a surprise to anyone. This is where we ended up. All right, so that was a lot to cover, and we obviously wanted to leave plenty of time because we knew there'd be a lot of questions. Just to recap, the PowerPoint will be sent out shortly after today's webinar, so you will have a copy of that. You've got all of our contact information should you want to have any follow-up questions. But the big takeaway, please make sure you're aware of the rules and are state, federal, this way, that way, and trying to make sure your business is as compliant as possible, and reach out to someone knowledgeable, whether it's VS or somebody else, to make sure you're aware of all the rules and make informed business decisions, as you move forward in this industry. Yeah, all right.
And just one thing, Michelle, somebody asked me about the link to the Colorado Task Force information. Whoever that is, just email me. My information is there on the screen and I'll send it over.
And I do think we also have.
Oh, somebody posted it.
Yep, and I think we also have, Colorado is one of many states who have done a task force report. So there's a few of them. We actually have a blog post on it. So just a cite to a blog. There's a lot of resources on our website. Take a look, and a lot of them are summarized there. All the most recent intoxicating cannabinoid task force. All right, thank you, Casey and Andrea and Jen, for driving the PowerPoint. Really appreciate everyone's time, and reach out to any of us with any questions.